Welcome to our detailed exploration of Stumbling on Happiness by Daniel Gilbert. In this video, we'll take you on a journey through Gilbert's fascinating research on happiness, cognitive biases, and the ways in which we stumble in our quest for a fulfilling life. From the outset, Gilbert makes a bold claim. Humans are bad at predicting what will make them happy. And he's not just offering an opinion. He's presenting scientific research to back it up. Our brains, while marvelously complex, have evolved in ways that don't always serve our pursuit of long-term happiness. In fact, the very mechanisms that help us plan for the future can lead us astray when it comes to predicting how we'll feel about the outcomes of our decisions. Gilbert introduces the concept of affective forecasting, a term used in psychology to describe the process by which we predict our future emotional states. Whether we're imagining the joy of buying a new house, the pain of losing a job, or the relief of finishing a stressful project, we often miscalculate how these events will actually affect our long-term happiness. The problem is that we're influenced by cognitive biases, such as focusing on the most extreme emotional outcomes while ignoring subtler details. But why does this happen? Why are we so bad at predicting our own happiness? One of the reasons, according to Gilbert, is that our brains are not designed to make us happy. They're designed to help us survive. Evolution has equipped us with powerful cognitive tools to navigate the world, but these tools are not optimized for happiness. Instead, they're optimized for solving problems, avoiding threats, and seeking rewards. In this book's summary, we'll explore how these cognitive tools, particularly our imagination and memory, can mislead us when it comes to predicting happiness. Gilbert's humorous and engaging writing style, combined with his deep knowledge of psychology, offers a unique perspective on how we think about the future and why we so often get it wrong. Chapter 1. The perception of happiness. Happiness is one of the most elusive and subjective experiences in human life. In this first chapter, Gilbert tackles the fundamental question: what is happiness, and how do we perceive it? He starts by pointing out that happiness is not a one-size-fits-all concept. What makes one person happy might not have the same effect on another. This variability makes it difficult for people to know, with certainty, what will make them happy in the future. Gilbert draws on psychological research to explain that happiness is often conflated with pleasure, but the two are not the same. While pleasure is a short-term sensation that comes from immediate gratification, happiness is a longer-term sense of well-being and contentment. Unfortunately, our brains often trick us into pursuing short-term pleasures, thinking they will lead to long-term happiness. This is why people frequently make choices that bring immediate pleasure, but fail to produce lasting happiness. One of the most fascinating ideas explored in this chapter is the concept of affective forecasting, which refers to the process by which we predict how we will feel about future events. Daniel Gilbert explains that humans often make errors in affective forecasting because we base our predictions on incomplete information. For example, when we think about buying a new car, we imagine the thrill of driving it off the lot, but we fail to account for the daily frustrations that come with maintenance, traffic, or parking. This mismatch between what we expect to feel and what we actually feel is at the heart of Gilbert's thesis. Our brains, while excellent at imagining the future, often fall short in predicting how future events will affect our happiness. Impact bias, one of the key terms introduced in this chapter, refers to our tendency to overestimate the emotional impact of future events. Whether it's the joy of winning the lottery or the devastation of a breakup, people tend to exaggerate how long and how intensely they will feel these emotions. The role of hedonic adaptation, another important concept introduced in this chapter, is hedonic adaptation. Gilbert explains that humans are remarkably good at adapting to new circumstances, both good and bad. This means that whether we experience a positive event or a negative one, we eventually return to a baseline level of happiness. This process of adaptation often leaves people wondering why they are not as happy as they thought they would be after achieving a goal or acquiring something new. Hedonic adaptation explains why material possessions often fail to bring long-term happiness. We may feel a temporary boost in joy when we buy a new gadget or a bigger house, but over time, we get used to these things, and their ability to bring happiness diminishes. Understanding hedonic adaptation is crucial because it highlights why the pursuit of material goods or external rewards often leaves us feeling unfulfilled in the long run. Chapter 2. The role of imagination. In Chapter 2, Gilbert delves into how imagination plays a critical role in how we predict future happiness, but he also highlights how unreliable it can be. Our brains rely on imagination to simulate future events, but this process is filled with inaccuracies and biases. Gilbert explains that imagination often fills in the gaps with information that isn't accurate, leading to flawed predictions about how we will feel. One of the main issues is that imagination tends to be incomplete. When we imagine the future, we focus on certain details and ignore others, which leads us to make inaccurate predictions about how we'll feel. For example, when planning a vacation, we might imagine ourselves lounging on a beach and forget about the long flights, airport delays, or hotel check-in hassles. These omitted details can significantly affect our overall experience, but our imagination tends to leave them out when we're predicting how happy we'll be. The focalism trap. Gilbert introduces the concept of focalism, which refers to our tendency to focus too much on a specific event and neglect other aspects of our lives that will continue to influence our happiness. For instance, when imagining how happy we'll be after moving to a new city for a dream job, we might focus solely on the excitement of the new role and overlook the fact that we'll still have to deal with mundane tasks like grocery shopping, commuting, or dealing with difficult coworkers. Focalism can lead us to believe that a single event will dramatically change our happiness, when in reality, life's everyday routines and other circumstances continue to play a role. Another issue with imagination is that it often fails to account for how time will change our perspective. We imagine how we'll feel immediately after an event, but forget that our feelings may change over time. For example, someone might imagine how ecstatic they'll feel after getting engaged or married, but their imagination doesn't account for how those feelings might evolve as the relationship matures. The problem of simulated reality. Gilbert goes on to explain that imagination often simulates the future inaccurately because it's based on current feelings and experiences. This means that when we imagine future events, we project our current emotions and circumstances onto them, which skews our predictions. If you're feeling particularly happy or optimistic today, you might imagine that future events will also bring happiness, even though your mood might change when those events actually occur. In the end, Gilbert suggests that our imagination is both our greatest asset and our biggest liability when it comes to predicting happiness. While it allows us to plan for the future, it often leads us astray by presenting an incomplete or distorted version of reality. The key takeaway from this chapter is that we need to be aware of the limitations of our imagination and recognize that our predictions about future happiness are often less accurate than we think. Chapter 3. Why we're bad at predicting happiness. In Chapter 3, Gilbert explores in greater detail why humans are so bad at predicting their future happiness. He introduces several cognitive biases that distort our ability to forecast emotions accurately. These biases are deeply ingrained in our psychology, and they often lead us to make decisions that don't align with our long-term well-being. Impact bias. One of the most common errors in affective forecasting is impact bias, which is the tendency to overestimate the intensity and duration of future emotions. Whether we're thinking about positive events or negative events, we tend to believe that these events will have a far greater emotional impact than they actually do. Gilbert provides numerous examples of people who believe that a particular event would drastically change their lives, only to find that their happiness levels returned to normal relatively quickly after the event occurred. For instance, studies have shown that people who experience severe injuries often report higher levels of happiness than they predicted they would feel. Conversely, people who win the lottery are not as happy as they imagined they would be. This is because of hedonic adaptation, which allows us to adjust to new circumstances more quickly than we expect. Durability bias. Another important concept in this chapter is durability bias, which refers to the tendency to overestimate how long the emotional impact of an event will last. For example, when imagining a negative event like a breakup or job loss, we tend to believe that the sadness or frustration will last much longer than it actually does. In reality, most people recover from emotional setbacks faster than they expect, thanks to the brain's ability to rationalize and adapt to new circumstances. Durability bias is closely linked to the psychological immune system, which Gilbert introduces in this chapter. The psychological immune system helps protect us from emotional harm by reframing negative experiences in a way that makes them more bearable. For example, after a breakup, Someone might initially feel devastated, but eventually come to see the breakup as an opportunity for personal growth or a way to find a better partner in the future. Presentism, another cognitive bias that affects our ability to predict happiness, is presentism, which is the tendency to project our current emotional state into the future. When we're feeling happy and optimistic, we tend to believe that future events will also bring happiness. On the flip side, when we're feeling anxious or depressed, we assume that future events will also be bleak. Presentism distorts our ability to make accurate predictions because it anchors us to our current mood, rather than allowing us to objectively assess how we'll feel in the future. Gilbert explains that these cognitive biases are universal and deeply ingrained in the human psyche. While they served an evolutionary purpose by helping our ancestors navigate a dangerous and unpredictable world, they often led modern humans to make poor decisions about what will make them happy in the long run. Chapter 4. Miswanting. Why we desire the wrong things. In Chapter 4, Gilbert introduces the concept of miswanting, which refers to the phenomenon where we think we know what will make us happy, but we're often wrong. Miswanting is driven by a variety of factors, including cultural influences, societal expectations, and our own psychological biases. One of the key ideas in this chapter is that we often pursue things that we believe will bring happiness because society tells us they should. For example, people may believe that achieving certain milestones, such as getting married, buying a house, or reaching a high-level career position, will automatically lead to happiness. However, research shows that while these achievements can bring temporary satisfaction, they often fail to deliver the long-term happiness that people expect. The influence of society and culture. Gilbert explains that societal norms and cultural messaging play a significant role in shaping our desires. We're constantly bombarded with messages from advertising, media, and even family members about what we should want in order to be happy. These messages often focus on material possessions, external success, or social status, leading many people to pursue goals that don't align with their true values or interests. For instance, someone might spend years working toward a high-paying job, believing that financial success will make them happy, only to discover that the job brings more stress and less fulfillment than they anticipated. This is an example of miswilling, pursuing something based on external pressures, rather than a genuine understanding of what will bring happiness. The role of cognitive biases in miswanting. Gilbert also discusses how cognitive biases contribute to miswanting. One such bias is the availability heuristic, which leads people to base their desires on recent or highly visible examples. For instance, after seeing a friend post about their luxurious vacation on social media, someone might start to believe that taking an expensive trip is the key to happiness. However, they may not consider other aspects of the vacation, such as the stress of planning, travel delays, or the temporary nature of the enjoyment. In this case, the person may miswant the vacation because they focused on the glamorous parts without considering the full picture. Another bias Gilbert discusses is projection bias, where people assume their current feelings or preferences will stay the same in the future. For example, you might crave a certain kind of food today and assume you'll feel the same tomorrow, even though your appetite might change. This happens with bigger life decisions too. People often pursue goals that match their present mood, but those goals might not bring the same satisfaction in the future. How to avoid miswanting. To avoid miswanting, Gilbert suggests we take a closer look at the things we desire. He recommends thinking carefully about what truly makes us happy, rather than what society or advertising tells us should make us happy. He also encourages readers to talk to people who have already experienced what they want to get a more realistic idea of how it will feel. Chapter 5. The psychological immune system. In Chapter 5, Gilbert introduces the idea of the psychological immune system. Just like the body's immune system protects us from physical harm, our minds have ways of protecting us from emotional harm. When something bad happens, like losing a job or going through a breakup, our psychological immune system kicks in to help us cope. One way our mind protects us is through rationalization. If you didn't get a job you really wanted, you might start thinking, that job probably wasn't right for me anyway. This is your mind's way of making the bad event feel less painful. Gilbert explains that the psychological immune system works without us even knowing it. Over time, we often find ourselves feeling better about bad events, even though we didn't think we would. This explains why people who go through difficult situations, like illness or accidents, often report higher levels of happiness than they expected. Hedonic adaptation. Getting used to new things. Gilbert also talks about hedonic adaptation, which is the idea that people quickly get used to both good and bad changes in life. Whether it's something exciting, like a new car, or something sad, like losing a loved one, people usually return to their normal level of happiness faster than they expect. This is because our psychological immune system helps us adapt to new situations. Hedonic adaptation is one reason why pursuing material possessions often doesn't bring lasting happiness. We might feel happy for a little while after buying something new, but eventually we get used to it, and it doesn't make us feel special anymore. Chapter 6. How memory and experience affect happiness predictions. In this chapter, Gilbert explains how our memories shape how we predict future happiness. The problem is, our memories aren't always accurate. Our brains don't store perfect copies of past events. Instead, they hold on to a few highlights and fill in the rest. Because of this, we often misremember how we felt during past experiences, and this affects how we predict future happiness. For example, if you had a bad experience at a restaurant but later had a great dessert, your memory might focus more on the dessert, causing you to think the overall experience was better than it really was. This affects your decision to return, even though the experience wasn't as positive as your memory suggests. Peak end rule. One of the key ideas in this chapter is the peak end rule, which suggests that people tend to remember the most intense moment of an experience and how it ended, while forgetting the rest. This means that if a vacation ends on a high note, you're more likely to remember it fondly, even if there were stressful moments along the way. Because of these memory distortions, people often make poor decisions about what will make them happy in the future. They rely on flawed memories of past events instead of looking at the whole picture. Chapter 7. The myth of rational decision-making. In this chapter, Gilbert challenges the idea that people make rational decisions when it comes to happiness. While we like to believe that we carefully weigh the pros and cons of each decision, Gilbert shows that many of our choices are influenced by emotions and subconscious biases. For example, when choosing between two jobs, you might focus on the salary and benefits, but deep down, you might be swayed by the office environment or the way the interviewers made you feel. This is because our brains are wired to pay attention to emotional cues, which can sometimes lead us to make decisions that don't align with our long-term happiness. The role of emotions in decision-making. Gilbert explains that emotions play a much bigger role in decision-making than we realize. While we think we're making logical choices, our emotions often steer us in certain directions without us knowing it. This is why people sometimes make decisions that seem irrational to others but make sense to them at the moment. Chapter 8. The role of others in predicting happiness. In this chapter, Gilbert argues that one of the best ways to predict your future happiness is to look at how others in similar situations are feeling. He calls this surrogation, which means using other people's experiences as a guide for your own. For example, if you're considering moving to a new city, you might think about how happy people are who have already made that move. While it's tempting to think, I'm different, my experience will be unique, the truth is we're not as different as we think. Looking at others' experiences can give us a good idea of how we might feel in the same situation. Why we ignore others' experiences. Even though surrogation is a good way to predict happiness, many people ignore it. Gilbert explains that this happens because we believe that our preferences are special and that others can't understand what we really want. However, research shows that using others as a guide is often more reliable than trusting our own imagination. Chapter 9. Control and happiness. In Chapter 9, Gilbert explores the idea of control and its relationship to happiness. Many people believe that having more control over their lives will make them happier. However, Gilbert argues that this isn't always true. In fact, the need for control can sometimes lead to stress and dissatisfaction. The illusion of control. Gilbert introduces the concept of the illusion of control, which is the belief that we have more control over events than we actually do. For example, people might feel that they have control over their health by eating well and exercising, but the reality is that factors like genetics and random chance also play a significant role. While a certain amount of control can make us feel safe and secure, too much focus on control can lead to frustration when things don't go as planned. Gilbert suggests that letting go of the need to control every aspect of life can actually lead to greater happiness because it frees us from the pressure of trying to make everything perfect. Chapter 10. Pursuing the right kind of happiness. In the final chapter, Gilbert offers advice on how to pursue lasting happiness. He explains that instead of chasing material possessions or status, People should focus on experiences that provide meaning and personal growth. Relationships, learning, and helping others are often more fulfilling than chasing wealth or fame. Finding meaning in everyday life, Gilbert encourages readers to find happiness in small, everyday moments, rather than waiting for big, life-changing events. He suggests that paying attention to what truly makes you happy, whether it's spending time with loved ones, pursuing a hobby, or helping others, can lead to more lasting contentment than chasing after things society tells us we should want. Learning from our mistakes, while we may stumble in our pursuit of happiness, Gilbert reminds us that we can learn from these mistakes. By understanding the psychological traps that lead us astray, such as affective forecasting errors and cognitive biases, we can make better decisions in the future and find happiness in more meaningful ways. Stumbling on Happiness by Daniel Gilbert offers a deep dive into the psychology behind why humans struggle to predict their future happiness. While our brains are designed to help us imagine the future, they are not perfect, and they often lead us to make decisions that don't bring the happiness we expect. Gilbert's work teaches us to be more cautious when predicting our future emotions and to recognize the biases that affect our choices. By understanding concepts like impact bias, durability bias, and miswanting, we can make better decisions that lead to more lasting happiness. At the end of the day, we may never be able to predict our happiness with complete accuracy, but by learning from our mistakes and focusing on the things that truly matter, like relationships, experiences, and personal growth, we can stumble a little less on our journey toward happiness. In this comprehensive book summary of Stumbling on Happiness, we've explored the cognitive and psychological factors that make predicting happiness so difficult. Through Gilbert's engaging writing and insightful research, we've learned that while we may never fully master the art of predicting happiness, we can use these lessons to make more informed decisions and find joy in unexpected places. By understanding the ways in which our brains mislead us, we can learn to stop chasing after fleeting pleasures and focus on what truly brings us lasting happiness. A new understanding of happiness. As we wrap up the journey through Stumbling on Happiness, we revisit the key idea that happiness is far more complex than we initially thought. Gilbert has walked us through a maze of psychological traps, such as affective forecasting errors and cognitive biases, that often distort our ability to understand what will make us happy. His insights show us that while we can never completely avoid these mistakes, we can become more aware of them, and that awareness itself is a powerful tool for living a more satisfying life. One of the central takeaways is that our imagination, though a remarkable tool for envisioning the future, is limited in its accuracy. The future often doesn't feel exactly how we predict it will, and the emotional highs and lows we imagine are often much more muted than expected. Learning to trust and experience over imagination. Gilbert's final reflections suggest that instead of relying purely on our imagination, we should place more trust in real-life experiences, both our own and those of others. As he explains through the concept of surrogation, observing how other people feel after going through similar experiences can provide valuable insight into how we might feel. By tapping into collective experiences, we can make better decisions and avoid the pitfalls of personal biases. Finding happiness in the present. A major lesson from the book is that happiness doesn't come from chasing future events, but rather from being present in the moment. Gilbert challenges the human tendency to focus too much on the future, whether that's dreaming about it or worrying about it. Instead, he advises us to pay attention to the things that give us joy right now. This shift in mindset can help us appreciate life's smaller moments, and over time, these moments accumulate into a more satisfying and happy life. What we can do differently. So, how can we apply what we've learned from Stumbling on Happiness to our everyday lives? Here are some key takeaways that can help us stumble less and live more fully. 1. Be aware of affective forecasting errors. Recognize that your predictions about how happy or unhappy you'll feel in the future might not be as accurate as you think. Instead of putting too much weight on future outcomes, try to embrace the present. 2. Challenge miswanting. Before chasing something you believe will make you happy, pause to question whether it's truly aligned with your values. Consider whether you're pursuing it because of external pressures or because it will provide lasting fulfillment. 3. Appreciate the psychological immune system. Understand that your brain will help you cope with future disappointments and hardships. Knowing that you will recover emotionally from setbacks can make life's challenges feel less daunting. 4. Remember the power of adaptation. Whether you achieve a great success or suffer a loss, you'll likely adapt to it more quickly than you think. This knowledge can help you put both positive and negative experiences into perspective. 5. Surrogation. Don't be afraid to look at how others have experienced certain events or situations before making decisions. Their experiences can often provide a reliable guide for your own. Moving forward as we conclude, it's important to remember that life is unpredictable, and no matter how hard we try to predict our future happiness, there will always be surprises along the way. Instead of feeling frustrated by this uncertainty, we can embrace it. Daniel Gilbert's work reminds us that part of the joy of life is in the unpredictability, and that sometimes happiness finds us in the most unexpected places. In the end, stumbling on happiness doesn't just explain why we struggle to predict what will make us happy. It gives us the tools to approach life with a greater sense of curiosity and openness. By being mindful of our cognitive biases and focusing on what truly brings meaning to our lives, we can learn to make better choices, be kinder to ourselves when things don't go as planned, and ultimately stumble a little less on our way to happiness. To sum it all up, Stumbling on Happiness is not just a book about happiness. It's a book about understanding ourselves. Gilbert has shown that the journey toward happiness is filled with detours, unexpected twists, and moments of self-discovery. We may not always get it right, but that's okay. The true beauty of life, as Gilbert reminds us, is that happiness is a journey, not a destination. We might stumble, but it's in those moments of stumbling that we grow, learn, and find the most unexpected joys. Life's imperfections, its unpredictability, and even its disappointments contribute to the richness of the human experience. The key is to approach it all with a sense of humor, humility, and openness. So, as you move forward in your own life, remember that you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to perfectly predict what will make you happy. Just focus on the present, be kind to yourself, and trust that even when you stumble, happiness is still within reach.